Thank you so much, Annika, for joining us today on this session. As you know, it's a 20-minute session. So thank you so much for your time and joining us, I think, live from Nairobi. Just to kickstart, if I can just ask you to introduce yourself. And from there, we're going to talk about sustainable mobility, Africa, and a lot of very interesting topics. So over to you, Annika, and thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks again for having me, Romain. It's a pleasure to be here. As you said, I'm here in Nairobi, Kenya, at the UNEP headquarters, UN Environment Program, where I work for the Sustainable Mobility Unit as a Program Management Officer. And I coordinate all our projects around electric mobility in Africa. So the whole unit is basically structured around three main areas. One is electric mobility, the other one is clean fuels and vehicles, where we support topics such as fuel emission standards on the regional level, but also on the country level emission standards. And then there is another topic on non-motorized transport, where we work a lot on walking and cycling policies for countries. Digitalization of transport is a new topic coming up, and the whole issue of how to integrate different transport modes.
That's a lot of topics already as an introduction. Fascinating, Annika. Thank you so much. Before going into detail of those topics, when I hear you and I picture you in Nairobi, and I've been to Kenya many times, and I know our audience also is interested in international countries and international development, I'm sure the first question that pops to their mind is, how can you achieve such an ambitious agenda where you see that EU members countries, for instance, and I don't want to name countries, but the EU countries we know are already struggling with their EV mobility agenda, the implementation of that, and it requires a lot of financial incentive from the government and a lot of studies to make that. So can you just highlight a bit what's the scope and how you see that happening in Africa?
Yeah, no, thanks. This is a great question. That's, of course, what's asked all the time, not only from people from Europe, but also in Africa themselves. Now, many countries will say, how am I going to transition to electric mobility if we don't even have stable electricity supply, right? And that's something that even in Kenya, which is like one of the more advanced economies in the region, we have blackouts almost every day, at least once, right? And the issue is usually not that there's a shortage of supply, but it's a more distribution and transmission issue. So many people are not aware of. They think we have a shortage of electricity, but actually Kenya, for example, has excess generation of renewable energies. There's a lot of hydropower, there's geothermal, they're tapping into solar, especially for rural areas. And actually the World Bank had a program on last mile connectivity in Kenya, where they actually connected like even small villages to the electricity grid. So actually there is a lot of electricity. It's just a problem with distribution and transmission. And there's a problem of financing of utilities, right? Electricity costs are very high in Kenya. So not everybody wants to be connected to the grid. So that's one issue. And electric mobility can actually help with that, because there can be an external battery and storage device. So that's one topic. But I think the other main issue is in Europe, when we talk about electric mobility, and I'm German, so I know very well what my fellow citizens say. They talk about light-duty vehicles, so cars, which especially in a country like Germany, where car ownership is very high, we're very have an automotive culture. But here we actually talk mostly about electric 2- and 3-wheelers. So this is the mode that we would try to electrify first, because actually that's what most people use, because car ownership in Kenya, I think it's around 50 to 70 cars per 1,000 people. Whereas in Germany, it's 560, I think. In the US, is way higher. In Ethiopia, it's 2 vehicles per 1,000 inhabitants. So if you electrify cars, we're not going to achieve anything, right? Not air quality improvement, no big CO2 emissions reduction. So that's why we have to look into other modes, such as 2- and 3-wheelers and buses.
I see. Very interesting. And now that you mentioned that, is that correct to say that the 2- or 3-wheelers are actually, in terms of clean fuel approach, one of the most detrimental to like air pollution compared to the 4-wheeler, the cars, etc.?
Often, yes, they are. Because there's often no two-stroke engines, so they are actually very high polluting, and they often are not have the same fuel economy equipment as light-duty vehicles, and also because in many African countries they're also used mostly as taxis or transport of goods and vehicles. So they run a lot of kilometers, many more than private cars do. For example, I come on a motorbike to work every day as a passenger, and then they do, 150 kilometers a day. And then their cargo, for example, when I arrived here, I had to get a washing machine. Well, that washing machine was transported on a motorbike to my house, right? Wow. Which is not the normal case. So that's also often why they say, okay, I can't use an electric bicycle or electric motorbike, because usually, at least the ones that were designed in China and India, are not made for such heavy loads. So then they think, okay, there's no way for them to switch to electric vehicles. That's why we have to invent like really custom-made products to the specific context that they're being used for, which is usually not transport of one person, but maybe two people plus a washing machine.
Yeah, I understand. And so now that we set the scene and the two-wheelers and the three-wheelers, I understand the problem, and the audience does as well, I think. What does it mean exactly to push that EV agenda? Does it mean working with two-wheeler and three-wheeler manufacturers to try to bring electric vehicles on the market? If so, all those manufacturers, you try to promote some local industry for that? Or are we talking about more the policy level to change the sort of, how you call that, the level of emission, the policy, the legislative side of it? Or is it a combination of both? I'm very curious to understand how practically that's transformed into various activities and actions.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Actually, it's all of what you mentioned. Here at UNEP, we now have a global electric mobility program, which works exactly in all the different aspects you mentioned. Of course, the core work of the United Nations is the policy level. So we work a lot on the national and regional level. For example, in Africa, we're working at the ECOWAS, the West African countries, the East African Community level, for example, on this whole topic of vehicle emission standards, because there's still going to be, so 80% of vehicles that come to Africa are imports. Secondhand imports from Europe, from Japan, right? Depending on left-hand or right-hand drive. So that's important if you have vehicle emission standards, right? That only clean vehicles come in, and also to support the import of used electric vehicles, where we need standards then on how to measure the capacity of the batteries, for example, so that we don't get batteries that have a lifetime of 2 days left, and then they're going to be dumped in some of these countries, right? And then we have the whole issue of electronic waste and recycling, which is something that is very complicated. So that's one aspect. Then the other one is the national level, right, where we work with Ministry of Transport and Energy and Environment and Climate Change and Industry, whoever. Electromobility is a broader space where it's not only transport, but also exactly the electricity supply, stuff that needs to be involved. So it's a lot of awareness raising. First of all, that this is a technology that's available already for the African market, right? And then what type of policies can we do to incentivize? And it's not going to be, of course, huge purchase subsidies of, I think I read a ridiculous number. Like I think every electric vehicle is like at least 2,000 or 3,000 euros of subsidies, in many European countries. Correct. Of course, that doesn't happen here, right? Here it's more of changing the duty structure. So like, for example, VAT exemption, higher duties for diesel and petrol vehicles, and then less or no duty for electric vehicles. That's on the national level. Then there's, of course, the local level, where we often have the topic of charging infrastructure. And there, for example, for 2 and 3-wheelers, we look a lot into battery swapping, which is possible, for example, even with solar energy, which makes it a lot cheaper than also to charge. And here actually is the private sector that's the main actor in most of the countries that I've visited so far, whereas actually small startups know that they're developing battery technologies, that are trying to build devices and set up new business models, innovative ones. Where, for example, a lot has been learned from the solar energy market, this pay-as-you-go scheme, where the driver can rent a vehicle for the same price as a conventional motorbike, and then pays leasing fees, and that then cover the cost of recharging of the vehicle. And then in the end, the cost will be lower than fueling, right? Because not only in Europe, but also here, the price of petrol is rising, which is actually the biggest expense for most people. That's why it's also attractive to look into electric vehicles.
Interesting, fascinating. On the question of the private sector, you mentioned there is this growth of the startup trying to create a new business model. So I have a multiple-fold question. One is, there are also non-African players that are interested in those markets, and I'm trying to come because I see for instance, in Asia, I worked a long time in Vietnam. There is all the same ecosystem of those players trying to bring those batteries into the taxi, the two-wheelers and three-wheelers. So there are also the players who come. And my second question is there any program that the UNEP or you do to try to bring in some financing along the private investors to put those business model into play, because maybe they need a bit of support at the beginning to make that business model happen?
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. So on the one hand, we also, for example, work with Asian vehicle suppliers, no, like that have already, no, in India, no, electric two-wheelers is already almost mainstream, right? So what we, for example, try to do is get some of these vehicles from some of these OEMs that are in India to, well, we have a pilot, for example, in Kenya, Uganda. We're doing one now in Tanzania, in Rwanda, to get them here, see how they work under local conditions, right? Because they're a bit different, no, the different climate zones,
Yeah.
maybe more, no, the topography can be different, flooding, whatever, maintenance. So we try how they work here and then see what can be adapted. So like we document, no, the lessons learned, do some data collection, and then this will all be open for then also for the local startups to take on, which are at the same time also not trying out their different vehicles, right? So I think it's definitely a collaboration, no, because then also you don't need only the vehicles, but then maybe the vehicle comes from India, but then the charging infrastructure can be developed locally. So it's really trying also to get a lot of local value chain. Because, for example, in Kenya, actually, if the vehicle is imported, built up, there's a high taxes. But if it's being assembled locally, the taxes can be zero. So there's a very high incentive to build up local assembly capacity. Even for electric buses, this is being in discussion for many of these countries. That's on the one hand. And actually also we have a project with the European Commission on transferring European technologies to the continents, where companies such as ABB, for example, work on deploying their chargers in e-bus project in the Seychelles, as an example, and see how this can be then be a transfer of knowledge. So that's on the vehicle side. And of course, the financing side is always a big topic. And here, I think, World Bank and Regional African Development Bank, they have a better grip than the United Nations, where we're focusing more on the policy and regulatory side. But actually, we have now launched what we call regional support investment platforms for electric mobility in Africa, in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, Middle East, and in Asia. And where we actually try to create what we call marketplaces, where on the one hand, the technology providers present technologies, where the project can come and see these technologies and see what fits. But on the other hand, also where financiers can come and first of all see that this technology is already available, it's trustworthy, because credit worthiness is always not the biggest challenge in these markets, because they think, okay, it's not going to work, so then they don't get credit, right? So that's something they also, the financiers have to see what actually works on the ground. So that's something that we try with all our pilot projects in the countries. And then also we offer a training program, which we have trainings now every month for different audiences. And one audience is actually also local financial institutions, that provide loans to vehicle manufacturers, to vehicle owners, right? So for them also to know that this technology is not riskier, for example, than others, or not to just be better able to evaluate this risk. And for now, I think in most cases, actually VC, venture capital, that invest in these companies, and then they can get. But I think there's a big gap between the projects that are like around the 1 and 2 million, and then there's the 100 billion loans of the World Bank, and then there's this gap of these 20 to 30 million projects, which I don't know where the solution is, but I think this is something where we could also, for example, look into carbon finance mechanisms. I think that's an interesting concept to see how we can generate offsets from electromobility projects that can be from private sector can buy these, and then we have another source of revenue for these type of projects.
That's a good one. What I take from this answer of yours is that we start talking about e-mobility and just one technical problem, and you basically explain to us that you're going across the entire value chain, and that's what makes the complexity. And when you say, I like as well your point about the gap between the pilot that you're doing at UNEP, you're trying to really create incentive and initiative. This marketplace is fascinating. I was not aware of that. And then you have the World Bank, who's really trying to put the accent on the financing. And very often what you see at the World Bank is that it's difficult to intertwine that many aspects of the value chain within one project. Very often it can be either infrastructure, or you mentioned non-motorized transport. It can be one thing, inclusive cities, etc. But you cutting across the entire value chain. You talk about the financial sector, assembly, manufacturers, so that has impact on job, duties, legal. I mean, this gets very complex, right, to put in place. So don't you think, how do you see that becoming scalable from having a pilot? Are you building on some like success stories at the pilot level to then talk to the community, the international financing organization, and all the players and say, look, this is a pilot that has worked. We can scale it up and bring it to another region or another country. Is that a bit the idea behind that?
Yeah. So I think the key, and I think it sounds a bit like, okay, you and blah, blah, but the thing is, the key is really partnerships and getting all the actors with the different strengths on the table. And that's, I think, the role that we are trying to play, as being like more this neutral facilitator role, which the UN plays in many aspects, right? Because we don't take parts, we don't benefit from anyone. We don't give loans out. No, we don't sell vehicles or charging infrastructure, right? We're just there most as the facilitator, trying to get everybody to sit on a table and discuss the common challenges. With an e-mobility is always not upfront cost, which is the main challenge. Okay, then there are innovative leasing models. And I think also what we try is the south to south exchange. For example, in Chile, we have seen business models for electric buses that have worked out for them, not to being the second biggest electric bus market, after China or between Europe, whatever. So like seeing also what worked in Chile, how can that be adapted, for example, to Africa? And then we invite, for example, experts from the Chilean utility to come to Kenya and talk to the Kenyan power and lighting company and what they have done and what has worked for them. And then see also what type of partnerships we can create and facilitate. And then we can talk to like private financiers, we can talk to the World Bank, right? We talk to the government and also see what are the challenges. And one other part that we are supporting is this topic of community of practices. For example, we are creating community of practices on electric two-wheelers, where we bring private companies, where we bring government, local operators, but also the users. We work on standards. For example, standards is a very important topic for electromobility, right? Because if every startup is developing their own charging plug, right, we will never get to scale. So that's why this whole topic of standards, I think, is also very important to get to scale in the sector.
I hope you have a large team working with you and for you, because those are a lot of topics to act as a facilitator. As you said, this is fascinating. May I ask you to switch? We covered a lot of mobility, and again, we can't go that much into more in detail. We talked about the fuel aspect of it as well, which I know is very important in the region as well. Can we spend a minute on non-motorized transport? You said it's one of the 3 pillars that you're working on, and you added digitalization. I don't know if it's a 4th one or if it's attached to non-motorized transport, but can you tell us a bit what is the thinking on that pillar? Is it about more inclusive cities? Is it mostly in the cities, or what is the UN thinking on that agenda?
Yeah. So I think it's a core topic, and unfortunately is underfunded, because also we at the UN, we have a core budget, but actually most of the project work we're doing is coming from donors. So we're getting money from foundations, from partners, right, for us to work on specific activities. And unfortunately, and I know the same because I also used to work at the World Bank, that the topic of non-motorized transport never gets enough money. So it's really, really hard to get big projects on non-motorized transport, right? It's always going to be an add-on on bus rapid transit project or a metro project or whatever sustainable city project, So that's something that also we at the UN struggle with, and that's why we actually mostly work on the policy level. For example, what our program has achieved in the past years was, for example, that every road that's being built in Kenya now has to have non-motorized transport infrastructure. So before, like, a road was just, you only got the funds for the lanes for the vehicles, right? But there was no budget provision for the sidewalk or a cycle lane. And now all the newly built roads, and I can see it already here in Nairobi, how unfortunately many of the roads are still old. They're not being, like, if they're being replaced, they're not new. Yeah. It's always kind of this like playing around, but at least the ones that are really being built from scratch, they actually now have cycle lanes and sidewalks, which we all know that's still like the most, the dominant mode in all of the African cities, right? So I think that's a mode that definitely needs more attention. And we also try how we can, through electric mobility, get a bit more attention, because it's also about talking about electric bicycles, right? And how to integrate this whole thing into like urban planning, right? But I think that's a big challenge. And also there's our colleagues from UN Habitat, who also work on this whole like urban design, urban planning topic. So we also try to work together on that. But for example, what might, like, part of our team, they're currently working on non-motorized transport strategies for different African cities and doing like a lot of lobbying work with the governments or the city councils on just to put a budget line for cycle lanes and then put money to that budget line, because I think that's where it starts. And that's usually mostly a public funded activity and not so much private, which is different from electromobility, right? Where actually the private sector plays a much bigger role.
But that would make sense, right? Because once there are still a lot of pedestrian and like walking is still one of the main mode of transport, not only in cities, but also in connecting regional cities. I mean, in other cities around, correct? And also I'm thinking in terms of value for money and return. I mean, the additional investment to have non-motorized transport included in the design and execution, the additional cost is marginal, correct, compared to the project investment size.
Yeah, no, that's correct. No, but the thing is, usually, no, it needs to be planned for that budget. So it is an additional, I don't know, 2-3% maybe to the cost, right? So it has to be budgeted for, and then depends on who's the financier of these roads, right? Because we all know a lot of infrastructure in these countries is financed by international donors, right? Like the World Bank, the Chinese, whatever. So it's also, of course, and I know, like from the World Bank side, that all these projects, they will always have this component in there. But often it has to be a decision also from the national government, to spend money on this, because it's usually for the poor people, unfortunately, because still, I mean, even though I tried 2 or 3 times to cycle to work here, but after a few near death experiences, I switched again. And the thing is usually, like, because the problem is most of our projects are funded by climate mitigation funds, right? And then the thing is, okay, building cycle lanes in Africa, it's not about reducing emissions, because it's just like improving mobility, right? So because it's not that the few people that have cars are not going to sell their car because now there's a cycle lane. And I think that's always the problem. Like, now it's all about climate change, but then if we're not reducing CO2 emissions, the project, then we don't get international money to finance these projects. And I think that's a big challenge.
Correct. And we've talked that in another session with a World Bank expert who was working in Rwanda, and she mentioned exactly the same issue. She said it's a problem sometimes of perception from the government that it's essential, even if they see that the locals, they walk and they try to bike and they need that element of just safety. We're talking as well about safety, inclusiveness. And second, she mentioned as well, in the execution, sometimes it's difficult. You have a plan, but then the way it's executed, it's not as, safe or as per the standards as good as it should be to really make a difference on the ground. So those are real challenge that are observed, right?
100%. Yeah, no, execution is always an issue. And then also government cycles, election cycles. Like, for example, now we have elections in Kenya in August, and also things then also change. And often cycle lanes are being used by motorbikes now because there's no cyclists, so then they have space, so they need to separate them. So that's also, definitely road safety is a big topic.
It's a big topic, but it's going to be another topic for another session, because when I have a good speaker like you, the 20 minutes, they go so fast, and we're already at the end of the session. So I just want to conclude to thank you so much again, Annika, for taking the time from Nairobi. And it was really a pleasure to have the discussion with you. So thank you so much again.
Yeah, you're more than welcome. Anytime. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.